What's up everyone, it's been a while, but I said I would make a new video when we had more information to go off of, and here we are. After a teaser and even more rumors, we are finally at the home stretch of Switch 2 speculation. On April 2nd, we will finally know everything about the console from games to the system itself. I remember rumors starting in 2021, so it feels good finally knowing that this saga is going to come to an end. Even though we're still getting a lot of games on Switch, we're missing the heavy hitters that we got when it was in its prime. Just to recap what's happened since last time, we got our first look of the Switch 2, and to no one's surprise, the leaks were correct, down to every detail like the snap-on Joy-Cons, the size, and the second USB-C port. We also got reports of the new, all but confirmed mouse feature for the new Joy-Cons. We still don't know the power level of the system, but I think it's safe to assume at minimum base PS4 levels, which by comparison seem kinda old, but Nintendo and their sub-studios have consistently performed miracles with the dated hardware for nearly a decade, so I'm not really worried. Rumors of AI upscaling also exist, which would allow Nintendo to prioritize the performance while still being able to achieve higher resolutions. This would also allow third-party developers to more easily be able to size their games down to fit the storage limit of the cartridges used for Switch 2 without sacrificing visuals. Now, as far as what we'll learn in this direct, Nintendo still needs to clarify some important details. First of all, when is this thing gonna launch? We know they're doing a handful of events until April 27th to let people try the system out. Assuming they release it on a Friday and in the following month, that narrows our options down to May 2nd, 9th, 16th, and the 23rd. I think there will be a buffer between the events and the launch, so I think the first two dates are out of the question. I'm gonna go out on a limb and say the 16th, which gives them ample amount of time to market it without keeping us waiting too long. I feel like they'd probably want to ride the momentum from the events, and waiting too long would make a lot of people lose interest and make it more likely that it leaks ahead of time. We also have no idea how much it'll cost. I think it's fair to assume that we'll be paying anywhere from $350 to $400 considering the more expensive hardware and inflation. Nintendo has always made it their goal for their products to be more affordable, so I'm leaning towards $350, but I think $400 is also very realistic. If there is a pack-in game this time around, I can also see $450, but I think $400 is the cap for the console alone. One of the biggest unknowns on the Switch 2 is the mysterious C button. We've seen it on leaks and in the teaser, however Nintendo has smoothed out the engraving to avoid us reading into it. There have been some guesses for it being related to a camera, but the system itself doesn't seem like it has one. It could also stand for Connect, serving as a shortcut to connect controllers or a new social platform. My favorite idea is the C standing for Cast, meaning casting the system to the dock wirelessly to play games either requiring touchscreen or just making use of a second screen. This would make sense since the button exists on the Joy-Con, meaning it'll mostly be used in handheld mode. I think this is a real possibility, but at the same time it would require extra hardware in the dock, which I'm not really sure Nintendo would do. It would, however, make for a very definitive console experience since it would mean almost every Nintendo game could be reasonably played on Switch 2. Now, before we get into games, I quickly want to bring up some of the operating system features I'm hoping for. I feel like the first Switch was rushed out the gate, so they couldn't really flesh it out. Now that they've had ample amount of time to get the Switch 2 ready, my expectations for it are so much higher. The biggest requirement for the Switch 2 operating system is an eShop that doesn't lag when you open it. The current eShop is borderline unusable and filled with cheap shovelware and AI garbage. They need to clean it up both performance-wise and moderation-wise. There was once a time where releasing games on a Nintendo console was genuinely difficult, and even games like Meme Run on the Wii U were removed for being not up to standard. It feels like there's just no standard anymore whatsoever, and I think that hurts the eShop a lot. Another feature that's oddly missing is folders. Folders weren't there on day one for the Wii U, so we all just kind of assumed the Switch would get them eventually, but here we are 8 years later and there's still no real way to organize our games. The last feature I want to bring up is a successor to Miiverse, Nintendo's social media platform. With how unpredictable social media has become between weaker moderation and the takeover of political content, I think it may be time for Nintendo to create a new platform under their own moderation, free of controversy and off-topic discussion. What was great about Miiverse was that people were able to discuss video games without any outside communities or influence getting involved. It would also allow developers to share posts directly to users like they used to. To modernize this type of feature, Nintendo could also release a new Switch companion app that allows access to the platform from a phone or a computer. There's lots of potential for this, and I do think with the current climate, it's a real possibility. Now for the most important part of the Direct, The games. Based on rumors, the Switch 2 was delayed this year so the first year's lineup could be stronger. So I'm expecting about 6 first-party games to be highlighted, and a handful of high-profile third-party games getting spotlights. I'll be covering the games in a loose order that I think they'll launch in, starting with the first batch of games being Prime 4, Mario Kart 9, and Nintendo Land 2. Starting off with Prime 4, this game has been in development since 2017, and we know for absolute certain it's coming out this year. I don't want to get too much into detail about the game itself since I've never played the Prime games, but I do think the Joy-Con mouse feature will be emphasized for this highlight since it is a first-person game. As far as the trailer goes, we're likely going to get a general story and gameplay rundown. I do think this will likely be the final trailer before the game launches, and since we know very little about it, I'm expecting a massive info dump. Mario Kart 9 is the only new game we know about that will be featured in the Direct based on the snippet we saw in the teaser. Just from what we've seen, there could be more players on the map at a time and the size of the courses look bigger. I think this is the perfect chance for the series to reinvent the way it handles cosmetics and be the true sequel to Mario Kart Tour. I expect the roster this time around to be huge and each character to have a handful of costumes to pick from. I've seen people talk about the possibility of the game becoming free to play, but I don't really think that will be the case. I can, however, see them implementing a Battle Pass-like system, like in Splatoon 3, where constant playtime is rewarded with cosmetics. Also, because Mario Kart is debatably the biggest Nintendo IP, I think it will get the update treatment the other Mario spin-offs get, but for a much longer time. Nintendo would be stupid and crazy not to capitalize on a new Mario Kart game with years of free and paid updates to keep the game alive, especially since this is the first new real Mario Kart game in over 10 years. The last of this batch of games is going to be a smaller scale game that makes use of all the Switch 2's power and features. I do believe it'll be closer to a successor of Nintendo Land rather than something in the vein of Wii Sports or 1-2-Switch, as I think Nintendo Land was a perfect launch day title for the Wii U. I don't think they'll exactly ride off the Nintendo Land branding, but it will definitely accomplish the same thing. Between using the Joy-Cons as a mouse, the presumable return of HD Rumble, and maybe even dual-screen gaming, the Switch 2 will have a lot to offer in terms of creating a fun new IP. In terms of release timing, I do think that all 3 of these games will launch before the end of June. Our new IP will definitely be a launch title for Nintendo to sell easily with the console, but I'm not really sure which of the other 2 it'll launch with. On one hand, I think Prime 4 would be a pretty banger launch title, but I don't necessarily think it's a system seller since Metroid doesn't really have the casual appeal that Zelda did when the original Switch launched. A wider audience would be more likely to pick up Mario Kart 9, though I do feel like there needs to be a single player game available at launch for people to play on their own. At the same time, if they decide to market the Switch 2 not only as a new console but as a way to enhance the experience of playing Switch 1 games, I think they could get away with having all 3 of these games at launch or releasing Prime 4 a month later. Going into the third quarter of the year, I have 2 games in mind. The first being whatever Sakurai's next project is. While we don't really have any big clue to what he's been working on, we've been told that his next project is going to be revealed soon according to the last video on his YouTube series. I don't think it's the next Smash game just because Ultimate is still getting the job done and I think the series needs to sit and breathe before the next entry. Originally, I was thinking it could be a reboot to F-Zero since he's brought new life to a dormant Nintendo IP before, but since we are getting Mario Kart 9, 2 racing games seems kind of redundant. My next thought was either a sequel to Kid Icarus Uprising or a remaster of the 3DS game, as Kid Icarus is one of the only major Nintendo IPs from the past 2 decades to not receive a follow-up, along with Star Fox and Punch-Out! As far as a sequel goes, I don't feel like enough people played the original to fully appreciate a new game, so I'm unsure if that's the best route to go in. We know that Bandai Namco opened 2 new studios to work on Nintendo games, with one working on a remake of an adventure game with 3D backgrounds. Kid Icarus Uprising 100% fits the bill for this, but at the same time, would this project, being a remake, really need Sakurai's involvement? It's possible a side story could be added on as a bonus to make the re-release feel worth it to people who have already played the game, but I'm still not certain. There have also been reports that this remake game that's in the works was either cancelled or put on pause, but there isn't any clear confirmation. I think the best prediction I can give is just Uprising remastered with more content, but it really is hard to say with how under wraps Sakurai's project has been. The second prediction I have for quarter 3 is the next Fire Emblem game. I think it's all but guaranteed the next entry will be this year, since it's been data mined that there was a Fire Emblem game started before Engage that's being held off. Looking at the timeline, not counting the Warriors games, a Fire Emblem game releases every 2 years. In 2015, there was the Japanese release of Fates. In 2017, we got Shadows of Valentia for 3DS. In 2019, we got our first Switch game in the series, Three Houses. After 4 years, we got Engage, which means there's plenty of time for a second game to be developed. Whatever Fire Emblem game that started before Engage has yet to be released and has been in development for practically 6 years. In the same leak that exposed pictures of Engage a whole 6 months before it launched, we got an extra crumb of information confirming the existence of a remake for Genealogy of the Holy War, the 4th Fire Emblem game, which has not been localized to the US yet. So, does this mean that it's finally time to get that lost Fire Emblem 4 remake? Possibly. It's important to remember that this is the launch of a new console, and there's been still 2 more years since Engage's launch, meaning another Fire Emblem game has surely been in development. Based on this information, I can think of 3 possible outcomes. The first one being that the 2025 game is just the Fire Emblem 4 remake. This game has been done for likely 4 years, and now might be the time to launch it. I do feel like this interferes with my last prediction of a Kid Icarus Uprising remake. However, I also think this game is technically not a remake to the US market since it's never really been officially released here. This would still mean that Japan has experienced a game they've already played, which brings me to the next outcome, which is the remake exists, but Nintendo chooses to release the other Fire Emblem game in development. This would probably be the smarter outcome, considering the Switch 2 is a new console and they want to give their launch year their all. At the same time, every year that goes by where they don't release that lost remake, the game becomes more and more dated, unless they're actively sprucing up the visuals over time. But who knows, maybe that's okay if it means they have a game they could drop whenever they feel a drought coming in their release schedule. This outcome would probably be my preference, but I do have one more suggestion. While I don't believe this is the case, I think it's worth bringing up. What if the rumors are wrong and the lost Fire Emblem game is actually a remake of Ike's first game, Path of Radiance? With the recent release of Thousand Year Door, Nintendo is clearly trying to give us access to rare games with a fresh coat of paint, and I think Path of Radiance is a prime candidate for this treatment. Is it possible that they chose to release Engage first because the scope of this remake was made bigger to include its sequel game, Radiant Dawn? This way, when the Switch 2 rolls around, the launch year would consist of a remake of not 1, but 2 games from the series with one of the most well-known characters from the franchise. I think this would make a huge splash, but there isn't really anything pointing to this being the case. I just figured I'd bring it up. For the last quarter, I feel like it goes without saying that Legends ZA will for sure take up Pokemon's normal November slot. They always do this to sell systems during the holiday time, so I don't really see why they would make an exception this year. The other big title for the end of the year will for sure be the next 3D Mario game. I feel like they specifically planned for this to come out the same year as the Switch 2, considering the last one was all the way back in 2017, making this the longest wait for a 3D Mario game that we've ever had. Ideally, this game would take the interconnected world design from Bowser's Fury and expand it from islands divided by water to a major landmass with multiple biomes and different layers of elevation to explore. I think this type of game is the natural next evolution of the 3D Mario formula, and I'm really excited because I think Bowser's Fury, while being a small bonus mode, was a genuine masterpiece. I think this game is probably going to take the exact slot Odyssey did in 2017 and launch in October. Something I want to bring up is the price point of these games. Something I'm sure a lot of us have been worried about since Tears of the Kingdom launching is more games from Nintendo being priced at $70 as opposed to $60. I do think higher profile launches like Mario Kart, Prime 4, the next 3D Mario, and Legends ZA will start being sold at this higher price point just because there's enough hype around these games that people would be willing to pay that kind of premium for them. That being said, I think for now, the next Fire Emblem and a lot of A and B tier series are safe from a price increase. Aside from these first-party releases, I think we'll get a number of third-party games shown in this direct. Games like Persona 3 and Final Fantasy VII Remake will definitely show up, as I think the only thing holding them back from being on Switch already is the weaker hardware, especially since Atlus and Square already support the Switch pretty well. I also think that, even if not in the direct, we'll get Red Dead Redemption 2, GTA 5, and the next Call of Duty game released this year as well. The biggest third-party game I think will be highlighted is a definitive version of Elden Ring launching this year. FromSoft is no stranger to the Switch, as Dark Souls 1 is already out, and they're one of the only third parties to have their own amiibo. Elden Ring fits the bill of a game that would be on Switch if not for the dated hardware, so I think that plus the status of the game to me sounds like it's going to cement itself as one of the big reveals of this direct. Now, these games are the ones I think have the best chance of showing up, but there are a few other series I think we could have news on this year. I don't want to deviate too far from the main topic of this video, so I'll save those predictions for later on, especially since even though this direct is really close to June, I still think we're getting a summer direct at the end of that month with second trailers for a lot of these games. So, were there any games you felt I missed? As always, let's get a discussion going in the comments as I'd love to hear what everyone has to say. We're pretty close to getting all this new info, so I'm hoping the Nintendo news gears start turning like they did in 2017, and we can have a lot more meaningful things to speculate about. But until then, I'll see you next time.